guys, and welcome back to the Wrestling Stoop with the legend himself, Bob Roop. I am your co-host, Ray Russell, here, getting ready to dive back into 1975 in championship wrestling from Florida. But in order to get that insight, we got to bring him back onto the show, talking about the host of the show. Here he is, the one and only Mr. Bob Roop. Bob, welcome back to the Wrestling Stoop.
Hey, Ray, good to hear your voice and know we're on the air together. Well, you know something I found out? This old body turned 82 yesterday, even after a couple of decades on the road. Now, I mean, it's only like an 8-hour drive, 8.5 hours. It's about 500 miles right on the nose.
And let everybody know what you're talking about, where you're going.
Going to the Waterloo Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame, the Tragos, Mike Tragos Blue Thesz Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame, which is associated with the National Wrestling Hall of Fame, which covers all amateur wrestling in every category.
Are you about to tell me your body didn't hold up through the trip?
Well, I was okay. I mean, you know, I didn't pass out, but anytime I sit for 4 or 5 hours with my knees bent, and then I get out, or I get out. The only time I do it's in a vehicle, and when I get out, I have to give my knees about 30 seconds to get reattach themselves to my the rest of my body before I want to start walking anywhere. I was sore, and I hadn't done any exertions of any kind. You know, I hadn't been baling hay or anything. So I figured it's just from sitting in an unfamiliar position for a while. You have to hold yourself up. I don't normally sit in that position, and certainly not for any length of time. So, but getting old and being tired beats the hell out of being permanently retired and 6 feet under.
Yeah,
I'm going to be cremated, so I'll be out there in open air in an ocean or somewhere. But I don't mean to sound more, but in my own mind anyway, I'm a long way away from being done with life. I've got a lot of stuff planned to do. I mean, and being here with you and our listeners is a big part of it. I mean, you talk about something that motivates you. And by the way, I want to pass on compliments to you. I had several people come up to me. Almost a dozen people came up to me, including a female, who told me that they listened to our podcast. They thought it was excellent. And they specifically mentioned you. A few of them mentioned you specifically. They said that your host is Ray Russell he's got a good podcast. He's got a good website. And I was glad to hear that, because I would tell anybody that wanted to listen about that. But it's nice when somebody tells you.
Sure.
So I wanted to pass that on to you. I don't know how much feedback you get, but I just wanted you to know that a bunch of them did come up to me and make real positive comments about our podcast together. So, well, thank you, Ray, for that. It's nice to get compliments out there.
At my age, I'm happy to hear it. Hopefully those people are listening to this episode, and I'd appreciate the kind words. We do our best here to flesh out all the old-time stories and have a great time in the process. And, so we'll just keep doing that, and hopefully they continue to enjoy the show. But, Bob, you got to meet, I'm sure, a lot of fans walked through there, had conversations with you, but you probably also got to catch up with some familiar friends, maybe even some new friends from the old school wrestling days.
Yeah, well, the reason I go, I mean, of course, if you've been inducted into the Hall of Fame, if they do you that honor, you should do what you can to be responsible and be grateful, and go to the way that the Hall of Fame, any Hall of Fame museum, the way that they stay flourishing and derive some income is from having, when they have their Hall of Fame meetings every year, to have the Hall of Fame members come, because when the fans come, the more Hall of Fame guy, those are the people they come to see.
Right.
Some of them come to see the new inductees, the people that will be inducted this year. The year I was inducted, Bret Hart, you talk about a class. I was in a class with Larry Henning. Bret Hart and myself were the live inductees. Dory Funk, Mike DiBiase, and an older wrestler a guy from a much earlier age, the early 1900s, named Tom Jenkins.
Yes,
we were the inductees, and then Nikita Koloff got the Frank Gotch Award, and Ted DiBiase was there to receive the award for his father. Terry, of course, was there to receive the award for his dad. So you talk about being in fast company. I didn't feel like I had that kind of stature, but I guess the rest of them did because they voted me in. So yeah, that was pretty heady stuff. I look back at it now much differently than I did 15 years ago. Wow. I don't know why. Now, Baron von Raschke is one of the main reasons. I've been friends with him for 60 years. I might have said this before, but it bears repeating, I think. When you have a wrestling friend from 60 years duration, we met when we were both in the U.S. Army. We were both on the U.S. Army wrestling team in 1964 that went and wrestled in the 1964 Olympic tryouts in New York City. So we spent about 5 months together. We stayed at West Point, which was about 50 miles from New York City, and the Olympic tryouts were held at the World Fair that was being held that year in Queens of New York City. So we were stationed at West Point, and we had a short, just 50 miles to get to the city. We wrestled not just the Olympic tryouts, but there was a national AAU tournament about a month before that we wrestled in too. So we got to go down there a couple of months. The tryouts were in July. So we got there, I think, like maybe April, maybe May, and we had a couple months to work out. Baron Raschke's, his birth name was James or Jim Raschke. He had been third in the world in Greco-Roman in 1963 as a heavyweight in the World Games. He was the second American ever to win a medal of any kind. Like you have silver, gold, and bronze. He won the bronze medal, and he was the first American or the second ever to medal in Greco-Roman from the United States. So he was a heavy hitter, and when I worked out with him, I had a high school state championship on my resume. That was about it. So working out with him improved me so much in a couple of months that I was able to compete at an elite level at that Olympic tryout, enough to win myself a college scholarship from the coach of one of the guys I wrestled. So when I say I go back to see a friend of 60 years, it's someone that without him, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you and our listeners today. So that's who wouldn't want to go? And Jim's 84 now. And he's still fine. He shows us signs of age. Of course we do. Anybody who was an amateur and a pro wrestler who can even walk at age 80 is doing good.
Yeah, you're doing okay.
Yeah. So we got together Saturday night for kind of a get-together farewell evening, and Sergeant Slaughter joined us. Oh, wow. And he and the Baron worked a lot with each other in the same territory with Vern Gagne for years, and they had all kinds of great stories about Vern and some of the idiosyncrasies and some of his caprices. And they had stories about, and both of them like to tell funny stories. They don't like to tell tragic stories.
Right.
So it's a good time talking to those guys, and Bob Slaughter is a really good guy. He wouldn't let us pay for a few. I only had one beer, but he wouldn't let me pay for that, so I taught him a lesson. I said, well, if you won't let me pay for the beer, I'm going to give you a hug. We don't know each other that well. But I gave him a hug anyway. So I don't care. One way to get to know you better, let me give you a hug. So maybe next year he'll make me pay my own beer so I don't hug him. But it was a good weekend. And
I'm sure you got to run into a few names that were being inducted and some of the other people that attended. I hope you had a chance to say hello to your buddy Jerry Briscoe. I think he was there.
Yeah, Jerry Sonable Patterson. Jerry is like a charter member of the organization. He's heavily involved in the banquet, the weekend itself. He's kind of like a helpful, directing kind of a manager or something. And by the way, I also want to thank the Hall of Fame. They're just super people. They, comp a room for us for the inductees, and the banquet is, of course, gratis, and they just treat you like, I don't want to say royalty, but, they make a venue where people can come and offer you, it's great to have fans say, hey, I remember you. I was 13 years old, and boy, I hated your guts and all that. And thank you very much for allowing me to hate your guts so much. So, yeah, it's really nice. And but you know what? By the same token, I was glad to get home on Sunday. my lazy boy, I had been thinking about it for the last 100 miles, and it was all that I remembered it to be.
This was all you were waiting to get home to recline and relax.
Get those legs up, save those knees.
Yeah. Well, it's good to have you back, Bob. I'm glad you had a great time. You know, I was hoping when you were headed there that it was going to be everything you wanted it to be. It sounds like you had a great time and got to hang out, and even I guess it would be your first memory of meeting Sergeant Slaughter in any capacity. I mean, he may have crossed paths with you somewhere at some point prior to that gimmick, but I don't know that that would be the case. So that was kind of cool that you got to have a couple stories told, you know, hanging out with some of the old timers. I hate to call it that, but that's what it is at this point in time.
Of course. Well, we are. I mean, John Mareski and I, the Baron and I are, you know, in our 80s. He's almost 85. So, yeah, that's old. Now, there's 85 and there's 85. There's people who are 85 who are, you know, who look 110. I don't think I look my age. I certainly don't act my age. But wait till you get there, and I'm sure we have listeners out there who understand what I'm saying, is that your perspectives change as you get older. You lose the ability to do certain things physically. Hopefully your mentality isn't affected by, you know, dementia or Alzheimer's or any of that kind of problem. If your awareness and your cognition stays healthy, then everything's fine, because you have all kinds. I mean, you can do all kinds of things now with computers. With a phone, you can read any book in the world.
Sure. Yeah.
Go anywhere. You can actually see a video. You can tour the Sistine Chapel in Rome on your phone. You don't have to go to buy a ticket and go to Rome to see it. You can see it on your phone. Yeah.
Well, I'm just glad that you guys had time to sit down with Rashke. You know, a longtime friend, literally longtime friend, 60 years. Wow, that is a long time. Yeah, 64 or what was that? 1964. Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, 64. And I'm fortunate to have a couple. I'm in a place where I went to high school and college, and I have a couple friends, high school buddies, that are older friends. We met in the early 50s, and I have lunch every or twice a week with one of my high school wrestling teammates, who also was in the same class with me. His father was the athletic director at Michigan State University when we were in high school, and a great football coach and athletic director. And my buddy and I played football and wrestled together. And I have a couple of classmates that are old, that I consider friends. Now, a friend, I'm not talking about an acquaintance, somebody you know. I'm talking about somebody you share, you know, you have an emotional bond with. And,
sure,
of course, respect and regard, trust. But you have to have trust. You know, you have to be able to trust people to be friends with them. But I'm fortunate to have a couple of older friends. Jim Rashke is my oldest friend from other than high school. Mm-hmm. And through him, I met a wonderful woman named Joyce Postian, and her husband, Woody Perkins, was added to the brew. And so when I go down there, I see Jody Malenko was there, Malenko's son, and he and I were friends. So when I go down there, I see four people that are real. I'm talking about friends. I'm not talking about acquaintances. I'm talking about friends that are involved. I'm involved with emotionally in terms of being able to tell them I love them. I have four people down there, which is really, really nice. You know, to be able to go down there. You talk about emotionally kind of a recharge. If you could go and be among four friends for a couple of days, that's really nice. So. Yeah, I wanted to explain. I kind of elaborate on why it's so pleasant for me. So
yeah, absolutely.
Maybe I'm boring everybody to tears. So if you want to talk about something violent, maybe we can move on.
Yeah, we'll get into the violence here in a second. I think that's a really cool deal, not just to be able to get together with some of the guys you used to work with, but some close friends as well. So very cool. I'm glad you enjoyed the time there, and I'll see if I can make that stop down to Waterloo next year. That might be a good time for me.
Oh, I'd love it if you did.
So
I'd love it if you did.
Oh, let's go back in time, Bob, and look at some of the stuff that brought you to Waterloo, and that is your wrestling career. Last we left off, we were in the early stages of 1975. You were headed to the ring to defeat Cowboy Bill Watts in a lights-out match for the Florida Heavyweight Championship. And you do go over. You succeed in defeating the Cowboy for the Florida title. Now, Bill Watts was leaving the territory, and he did the right thing. He put you over on the way out, and Bill Watts goes off, and he begins to start working in the tri-states, slowly building ground there where he's going to develop Mid-South Wrestling. So kind of a fun story as Bill Watts leaves Florida for Tri-States, the McGurk territory. But Bob Roop now is the Florida heavyweight champion, is basically where we're at here in the story. And there's just some names I want to throw at you again this week. I know you said you had some stuff to talk about in regards to some of these names last week. So if you're ready, we'll dive back into 1975.
Sounds good.
All right, so let's just address the elephant in the room right out of the gate here. And I'm talking about the promoter himself, Eddie Graham. He's stepping back in the ring sporadically, depending on, what stories are being told and when he can work himself into an angle or pay himself a few extra bucks there. How much do you think Eddie ever ripped himself off? I doubt that. So I'm looking at these early months of 75, and several times throughout here, mostly with the Mongolian Stomper as your partner. We talked about Archie Goldie last episode, and here he is as your partner more often than not in these matches. But you take on the likes of Eddie Graham and son Mike repeatedly here. And I have to ask you, we talk a little bit about Mike, not a whole lot. So I'm going to get into Mike if you don't mind. But first, I want to talk about Eddie Graham. And you talk about, it was probably a good match because I don't remember it. But I have to believe you got some stories about stepping in there with, I guess you could call him in some ways your mentor, as far as the wrestling promoter goes, and taking you down to the snake pit and getting you started and all that good stuff. So tell me about this time working in the ring with Eddie Graham.
Well, you've got a good point. When you talked about it, of having him we talked about this in a previous program about being recruited, having him come up to Detroit to that amateur wrestling tournament.
Yeah.
And be at the banquet, be recognized and all that. So I started out with, I wasn't awed or anything, but I was impressed. So here was a guy who's a flamboyant pro wrestler, and amateur wrestling is never, at that time, and we're talking way back in 1969, but at that time, pro wrestling and amateur wrestling had nothing in common. The amateur wrestling had absolutely no use for pro wrestling. It's kind of considered an embarrassment. If somebody said, oh, you're a pro wrestler? He said, oh, what, are you kidding? No, I'm an amateur wrestler. I'm a real wrestler. Yeah, Eddie was, when he got the kind of reception at the banquet of asked to stand up and take a bow, I was impressed. And we went back down to Tampa. When I broke in down in Tampa, he had me going to the high schools and areas where there'd be a big auditorium that would be full of people. A lot of them were teenagers or school kids, usually high school. And as the Olympian, I would go and Eddie would introduce me, and I would talk to these kids about drugs, about not doing drugs. What was not amusing, but was ironic at the time, was that Jack Briscoe and I were just learning how to smoke pot. Neither one of us had ever smoked it before, and somehow we got to it. But back in those days in Florida, it was a felony to even have any. Like even one joint was like a felony. So it was risky business. But anyway, Eddie had me going to these get-togethers, and the people that would be there on the reviewing stand with us would be like the sports anchors from the 2 or 3 television stations in Lansing. These guys used to have on TV every night. Right, local. So I was on. Yeah. So here you are, Eddie's in heavy company, and he's being given the same kind of respect as these people. Well, of course I was impressed. But then we go into the auditorium, and they have me wrestling these people that they actually lure down there by having a sign behind Gordon Soley on the TV show, and which Gordon would read, or at least would tell what it was, that anybody interested in becoming a pro wrestler come down to the sportatorium and try out. And what they did is they brought them down there and beat them up. The idea was to bust somebody up, and then when they went back out into the public, back to their own stomping grounds, I've talked about this before too, they would have a mark. There were times they wanted me to break arms and legs because that's you got a cast on your arm or your leg or whatever. That's no way to hide that. But and that's what Eddie was doing to the people. That all I did was make them. I put the sugar hold on them and made them unconscious or totally helpless. I could have jumped up and down their head if I wanted to, but I didn't want to hurt anybody. That's why I learned these holds that were submission holds that would, and putting somebody out also put them in a situation there was no way they could hurt me. But when they be leaving and still groggy and stumbling around, Eddie would sucker punch them. So when I saw Eddie do that, I mean, to me, that was just totally vicious. He always busted them open. Well, years later, Terry Funk explained to me the reason they did that was that because these people, and again, I'm repeating myself, but these guys had told everybody in the world that they were going down to work out. Everybody they knew, let's put it that way. They were going down to work out, and if I just stretched them, where even if they had to lay in bed for a week because they were so sore, once they got back up and went back to the bar, people asked them, "Hey, how'd the trout go?" And I said, "I went down there and I found out it was all fake, so I didn't want to. I decided I didn't want to do it." But if they had a busted eyebrow or a broken arm, what are they going to say? I mean, how'd that happen? So that's why Eddie would bust them. But rationale aside, no matter that he was defending his own business aside, I'm watching him do that stuff, and to me, he looked like a vicious thug. So here I've got the contrast of a guy who is getting accolades from a national organization of wrestling, of amateur wrestling, who I see in private as this like real gunsel, really nasty guy. And I still feel that way in a sense. Sorry, Eddie, rest in peace, but you didn't have to lure those guys down there. If these guys had showed up and were pounding on the door, or if they were in the arena jumping up and down saying, "Hey, it's all fake," and hurting your business that way, then okay, I could say deal with them by maybe taking them in the ring right there in the arena. And I would have gone out there and taken somebody on, and I mean, not happily, but I would have. If they're calling me a phony, I would have taken them on and done, what I could to show that wasn't the truth. Well, it was. No, we weren't phonies, but wrestling wasn't real. But if you can convince people that it is, The Exorcist wasn't real either, but it scared the crap out of me. So to this day, I remember the people in The Exorcist and the actors in The Exorcist, and they convinced me. So the real person, of course, there's nowhere like that. But the same thing, if you can convince people that what you're doing is real, and not for the idea of getting in their pocketbook, but for the idea of entertaining them, of giving them a good show to where they can put their disbelief aside and get involved in what you're doing, that takes skill. So in that sense, yes, we were entertainers rather than actually athletes, but it took physical ability, especially when you're young. You don't know how to go out there and have a psychological cat and mouse type match, which you can do when you're older. You can do 5-6 minutes without ever even touching your opponent, playing some kind of cat and mouse game with them. And when you're young, you have to go in there, and usually you have to show you what's happening by taking bumps, by getting slammed or backdropped or whipped into a turnbuckle or punched or whatever. So it takes some physical ability, stamina, hand-eye coordination, and all that to do all the things in a way that's not an expose. I mean, we're just throwing punches, for example. I didn't throw punches for the first year probably. I used forearms because I didn't have a good punch. And then the other factor with Eddie Graham was that he was an alcoholic, but he was dry. He was sober when I met him. And the first, let's say 10 years that I was in the business, not 10, maybe 7 or 8, because the last time I ever saw Eddie, I worked against him in Orlando, and he had gone back. He had fallen off the wagon. He was back. He was back in the bottle, and I mean, it was bad. He was drinking during the day, and he came down, worked in a tag match against him in Orlando, and he came down. He was not staggering, but you could tell. Maybe the fans couldn't, but I could tell he'd been drinking. And then in the mat, Eddie had only one eye that worked. He was blind in one eye. And so when he punched me once, and he hit me right in the mouth and knocked my teeth. My teeth went through my lower lip. And it's one of those things where, I mean, it didn't go all the way through to where I need stitches, but it cut it bad enough. It's one of those things where, I mentioned this before too, where it's like a cold sore in your mouth while it's healing. It's just so irritating. Let me back up a little bit. This is when Eddie was still sober. He came to me and asked me to do a match with him in Tampa. I'm not sure if they even added the match. We might have already been booked. But what he wanted to do, and this is the only time this ever happened in my career. I never let anybody else ever cut me. He came up and he said, I would like to get color tonight, but I want to do it. And here's why. He said last week, and let me preface this by saying my whole attitude about Dusty Rhodes has changed. I now see Dusty as a very, very canny, wise businessman who was light years ahead of me in terms of promoting himself. I have immense respect for the guy. But in this particular case, because I'm going to tell a story that kind of detrimental to him, so I don't want to come across like I hate Dusty Rhodes. I admire him tremendously. I really do. But Eddie came to me and he said that Dusty had been in a match in Tampa, and it doesn't matter who he was against, but Dusty's routine was that, he'd come out, heel would pull around, try to take over him somehow. Dusty'd usually, Dusty'd catch him with that elbow when the guy was coming off the ropes or something, and then he would take over. But if instead of Johnny Valentine taking Jack Briscoe and putting him on a hold for 20 minutes and building the heat that way, the way Dusty got his heat put on him was by getting juice.
Sure.
So did a lot of guys. So did Abdullah and the babyface.
That's a whole nother story.
yeah. So, and that's what Dusty did was, what he did in Tampa, apparently, Eddie Graham this is set up what happened. Eddie had a girlfriend. He was married had a wife in Tampa. He had a girlfriend that lived in St. Petersburg, and they had a child. And
wow.
Well, but I'm not offending anybody that is part of the story, but it is something that happened to me. And so in order to make it, I have to tell it truthfully. What had happened, his girlfriend had come to the matches, and Eddie hadn't smartened her up. She thought wrestling was real. And what happened that night was when Dusty got juice, he basically took a bump and he just sat up. He was just sitting there. And he closed his eyes and he started scratching his forehead. And then, in plain view, and then he started bleeding. Well, his girlfriend was watching that, and she said, well, what is that? He scratched his forehead and then he was bleeding. But imagine this, Eddie's had this girlfriend, I don't know how long, but if he's got a child by her, certainly at least a year. And she's quite, and he's kayfabed her the whole time and told her it's real. Imagine if he has to tell her, well, it's really not real. So what he did with me, he wanted me to bleed without having any possibility of me doing it myself. So we went out and had a match, and he had the blade on his finger, and he tied me in the rope. And his girlfriend was there, of course. He brought her back the next week, and he tied me in the ropes. He had the blade on his left forefinger, and he grabbed me with his left hand by the hair, and he punched me. And then when he went back and to grab my hair again, he gigged me, and then he punched me. And, well, he gigged me right in the middle of my forehead. And it wasn't bad. I mean, it wasn't like an inch long. It was about, maybe a third of an inch long, but it was deep, and it left a scar. I did, maybe 100, maybe, I don't even remember. I did a number of blade jobs, but sure. I did them up with my hairline. I didn't want scars all over my face. I know we're going to be doing this forever. That's the one scar I still have, and I call that my Dusty scar. But so
scar dust.
Yeah. I'm going to change it. I'll just change the name. That's my scar dust. I love it. Good one, Ray. Yeah. So, there was that side, and I was not happy, but I didn't have a problem doing it. I felt like I was helping protect the business, it was kind of for a personal reason. But now let's go back to Eddie started drinking again. He hadn't started drinking again yet. Now he started drinking again. We had the match in Orlando where he busted me open. And then the next time I went back there while he was still alive, we had done our opposition in Knoxville, and he was one of the people sending talent up to fight against us in Knoxville. Ronnie Garvin and Bobby Orton and I and Malenko decided to go to Florida and wrestle against him, do an opposition show against Championship Wrestling for Florida.
Mm-hmm.
And we got together with a guy named Ronnie Hill that had a wrestling school down there, and he set us up in some little town. I don't know if there were 10 people ever showed up, but it was symbolic in the sense.
Sure.
We were another promotion running against Florida.
I bet Eddie loved that.
Oh yeah. Well, anyway, I didn't go back until after he committed suicide. Unfortunately, it's always tragic to report. When I did go back one time, a banker that Eddie had hooked me up with had come by the wrestling office for some reason, and he and Duke Kiyomuka and I were down in the front vestibule just talking about things, and somehow the question of Eddie came up, and the banker told us that what had happened with Eddie, he was in the hospital. He had some sort of abscess or something on his leg. He went in the hospital. Before he did, he had been contacted by a confidence man, a con man,
mm-hmm.
who sold him some property that was worthless. He sold him a swamp or something for like $800,000. And the banker was the reason I'm telling the story, because the banker was the one that gave him the money, that loaned him the money.
Oh, wow.
Eddie didn't have $800,000 in liquid assets. He might have been worth that and more, but he didn't have that kind of money in the bank. The banker looked at the deal for Eddie, and he advised him against it. He said, Eddie, this is a really bad, risky, it's a risky deal.
Mm-hmm.
My advice is don't do it. Well, Eddie went ahead and did it anyway. And when he came out of the hospital on Monday or Tuesday, whenever it was, the guy was gone, his money was gone, and the property turned out, I don't know exactly what the deal was, but it turned out that it was worthless. He was out $800,000. The interest alone on the loan was $14,000 a month. So here he is, a guy who's been manipulating all of his adult life as a pro wrestler, who's just been manipulated, out of his fortune, or a lot of it.
Yeah.
So here's where Duke came in. Duke said Eddie's girlfriend, by this time, Eddie had constantly told the girlfriend that he would leave his wife and marry her. And then that's got to be aggravating after 5, 6, 8, 10 years. And then once he started drinking again, that might have been the icing on the cake as far as she broke up with him. Duke said that Eddie just couldn't believe it, and his ego wouldn't let him call her and beg her to come back. But what he would do, Duke said that he would be in the office on Tuesday night. He had to go to the matches and pick up the gate receipts and bring them back to the office and put them in a safe. He said that several times he came in there in the middle of the night, like at midnight, after the matches were over in Tampa.
Mm-hmm.
He would come and unlock the front door and come in. Duke would open the door and come in and shut it and turn on the light, and Eddie'd be sitting there. And Duke said a couple of times, it didn't scare the hell out of him, but it startled him. So Eddie was sitting there waiting for what he was sitting there for. He was waiting for the girlfriend to call, hoping the girlfriend was called. Now, here on midnight on a Tuesday night, and you're sitting in the wrestling office hoping the girlfriend that broke up with you is going to call you. How far down the road, how far around the bend are you going to be gone to have that kind of, rationale?
Right.
So the reason I'm telling this is because I saw Eddie go from, that old saying, going from the outhouse to the penthouse and then back. I saw that. I didn't see him get out of his drunken years and all that, but I saw him when he was at his peak.
Right.
Respected and all that. And then here's another factor. He made Jack Briscoe. He made him, a world champion. Jack got his first break in Florida, and he ended up being a world champion. He was a big time partner with Dory Funk Sr. and Bob Geigel in getting both the Funk Boys and Harley Race the world title belt. He was a major player in the NWA.
Oh, there's no doubt about it. Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, yeah, he was a major player. And he was highly regarded in Tampa. The reason that he was so adamant and pissed off about anybody doing opposition was because a lot of times the other wrestlers didn't have, they didn't have Harley Race, and they didn't have Ric Flair, or they didn't have Jack Briscoe. They had guys that were just learning their trade. They'd go out there and do the same thing that we were doing, but they weren't doing it very well, and it was very obvious. Plus, you had a bunch of guys that as soon as they got out of wrestling school, they dyed their hair, and blonde. They dye their hair blonde, get tan, and start walking around with their T-shirts rolled up over arms that were about 10 inches around, and bragging about being pro wrestlers. And Eddie would have businessmen, like, say, for example, that banker, who would come up to him and say, "Oh yeah, I ran into a guy the other day, a wrestler. Is he working for you?" And Eddie said, "No, no. Who was it and where?" In other words, these other guys, it wasn't just a competition. He felt like these other people exposed to business. When you have managed to, through hook or crook, or by being so, let me back up a second. When I repeated earlier, when Larry Christoph and I went down in 1979, when we first went to Tampa, you remember me telling how he took us up to the Tampa Tribune, the head sports writers. Mm-hmm. He was welcome. We walked right up there. He was welcome. I think what he'd been doing, in fact, I'm sure of it, every year he was sending those guys a $50 bottle of scotch or a case of champagne or something, like every Christmas or on their birthday or something, to continue to get good press and all that. So he had, he is considered a viable but legitimate business. So if he got exposed, he had a lot to lose. He had a lot to lose, his prestige, his respect, and all that. So I can understand why he would be so vicious about trying to protect that. But again, by the same token, you're doing horrible things sometimes that come back to haunt you. And he was a big, I know where I was going. He started Jack with Funks, myself, Dusty, and yet by the end of his life, he lost all of us. Nobody really had, he wasn't like if someone like Paul Bosch had been your mentor.
Right.
Or your sponsor, your patron, where you have this, you have this gratitude and you're grateful and you're proud. Oh yeah, I had Paul Bosch. Paul Bosch started me. Yeah, Eddie didn't have any. None of us were talking about Eddie that way, because the problem was at the end he was always underpaying. One of the reasons that Jack got the belt was that Eddie told, or they understood, that the people that took the belt did it with the understanding that although the payout was supposed to be 10% of every house, with 2% going to the booker for the champion, that you weren't going to have to actually pay 10%. If you had a $50,000 house, you weren't going to have to pay the champion $5,000. You could give him $3,000. Eddie guaranteed that Jack Briscoe would take it. I don't know if the Funks, Dory Sr. or the Funk brothers agreed that they wouldn't hold the 10% NWA people to it.
Yeah.
But I know it rankled Jack because he told me it did. One of the NWA conferences, when Jack was champion, he was supposed to be at Vegas at the meeting. He was supposed to drop by and talk to the owner, all the promoters, and he didn't show up. Eddie called me, was looking for him, and he said, "Do you know where Jack is?" I said, "No." I was a heel by then. I didn't know where he was. So, yeah. And later when I talked to Jack briefly, I asked him, "Why didn't you go?" He said, "Well, I was blowing my neck a little. I didn't like the way I was being paid." Yeah. By the time Eddie passed away, and Dusty had kind of left him behind and didn't have much use for him, and same with Jack. So, I can see how his life would have kind of turned kind of dark there. Yeah.
That's a unfortunate ending, to somebody who had so much. Like you said, you saw him at the peak, and that was a hell of a peak in the wrestling business anyway. To be sitting on top of the world, literally, as far as wrestling goes, was Eddie Graham. I mean, one of the top dogs in all of the NWA as far as the promoters went. Like, he was always part of the big deals, the big, like the world title changes. He was certainly had his say, and he was a guy that Vince Sr. dealt with often and would bring guys up and work at the Garden. Or again, Bob Backlund, Eddie was one of the guys, one of the confidants that said, "Hey, take this Bob Backlund guy, give him the belt." It wasn't just Eddie, but Eddie was in on that conversation. So Eddie Graham had a lot to do with a lot of guys' success. But unfortunately, it just sounds like, man, and I'm not saying it was just going back to drinking, because I don't know the official date that Eddie pick back up the bottle or the reason that caused that to happen eventually down whenever that transpired. But it sounds like at some point Eddie just kind of got in over his head and a lot of things, and it all caught up to him in the end. And that's just really a tragic, unfortunate way to go. Not just because it was suicide, but with everything that led up to it. I could see where that would cause you a downward spiral. And, it's unfortunate, but I'm glad we were able to tell the story here a little bit.
Well, yeah, and it is unfortunate. I'm not happy telling the story, but it's history. I mean, it's part of my background. It's part of my history. And, I do give Eddie credit where he has it coming. Being applauded and regarded with gratitude and appreciation at a national banquet for a national tournament, having everybody stand up, having everybody give him a hand. We started at the very top. The first time I ever met him was the top of the heap. Well, I'll take it back. A few years later, I'll repeat that he sponsored a tournament in Tampa. Fort Homer Hess to the Armory had the most legitimate wrestling in the world, a national AAU Greco-Roman tournament. We held a tournament for 3 days, and Eddie was the tournament chairman. I was the manager, and I brought down my college wrestling coach to run the tournament for us. Mm-hmm. Eddie sponsored all that. You had to pay the building and, some cost and things. So, he did good stuff. He was smart that way. He had the Florida Sheriff's Boys Ranch, which supported runaway kids and kids with problems that were out on the street. I know that being able to advertise that on TV, as did Dory Funk, and I think Funk started it, and then Eddie copied it. Yeah, having that some of the money that you patrons are giving is just going towards the Florida Sheriff's Boys Ranch to just helping troubled kids. That's a great thing to have on your show.
Sure, absolutely.
You look like you're involved in your society. You're being a member, a working member, or towards the betterment of the society you're in. So it was real smart.
Well, very cool. That's I'm sure we'll dive back into Eddie as time goes on. And hey, you got your scar dust out of it, so you always got that. Every time you look in the mirror, you can think of Eddie Graham. And I'm sure he did that. I was listening when you were telling that story that his mistress, if you will, sitting there watching Dusty basically gig right in front of her. And then he decides, well, I'm going to show her that I'm real. At the very least, Eddie Graham is real, because when I punch Bob Roop, he's going to bleed. And for the fact that your arms were trapped in the ropes, it was like it was that extra mile to make sure that your hands were nowhere near your head.
Yes.
It was just.
Oh, that's what it was for.
Yeah, that's great stuff.
Yeah, I couldn't possibly have done it. My hands are tied up. Yeah. He was, and I don't know if he went to her with the argument that I'm legitimate. I mean, himself to his girlfriend, or no, what you thought you saw with Dusty wasn't. That's not what happened.
Right.
But if she ever went to another match and guys got shoes, she was going to see him reaching up to their forehead too, somewhere along the line.
Right.
I always hated that. I mean, I don't want to get real technical here. I know some wrestlers listen to this, and I don't want, the boys say, oh, you shouldn't be exposing the business. But I always say, well, if Ric Flair can do a video about it, I can certainly talk about it. I mean, he has a lot more visibility.
That ship sailed many decades ago, Bob.
Yes, it did, didn't it?
But there's not much you can do about it except for just enjoy being able, like you used to talk about, you watched some of the guys before you, and they weren't able to enjoy and tell the stories and have fun with it and go out in public and just share this and enjoy the fans and all this stuff because they had to continue protecting the business. And I think your era and beyond are lucky because you guys are able to do all of these things and talk with the fans and share these stories and have something to laugh about. And these stories are now out there forever, right? Imagine all the stories that Sputnik Monroe and all the guys before him could have told if they had just been given that opportunity. Those are lost stories to time, unless you heard it and can pass it on, we're screwed, man. Because so many great things that I can't imagine back when it was the real wild, wild west in wrestling with those guys, the stories they could have told. I'm sure.
What I was able to bring with Don Colt, Don Fargo.
Yes.
Some of his stuff. I mean, because he was gone by the time I told it.
Everybody go read the Don Fargo book. My God.
Oh yeah. Well, like all the people we talked about.
Yeah.
The ones that we talk about books, Jody Hamilton, and I'm reading the grappler Len Denton.
He was at the Hall of Fame.
He was there. At the autograph signing, he was sitting at a table next to me, and I always liked him. A great worker and good guy, real good guy. He was sitting next to me, and we were talking. And I saw he had a book. He wrote a book with a ghostwriter. Mm-hmm. Well, same with him. I bought his book, and I was only going to give him $15, but he wouldn't take it. He said, "No, I'm not going to take your book." So I said, "Well, autograph it for me." Well, yeah, so he autographed it. So I handed him the $15. I told you, I'm not going to charge you for the book. I said, "I'm not paying you for the book. I'm paying you for your autograph." and he took the money.
Well,
as a writer, I used to do it too. As a writer, any writers out there, don't give your book away. You spent all those years selling it. If your friends want to buy it, don't give it to them, but let them buy it. Just autograph it to them. You could say to my friend, my special friend, that'll be much more, because all the work that goes into writing, oh my God, the hour, you got to do it alone. You're alone when you're doing it. Some of the easy, now that's the easy part of a book. The hard part is selling it. So you dang sure don't want to be giving it away. But anyway, I got Len's book, and I've even read, we talked about Mick Foley's book.
Sure.
Now, Mick doesn't sell through Scott Teal, but Jody Hamilton, Rocky Johnson, I don't know.
Mephisto.
Mephisto's book, yeah, I've got that one too. Oh yeah, Scott Teal operates folks by he interviews people and he takes notes on what they tell him. They have
lots of notes,
long phone conversations, 4 or 5, 6 hours. If someone's the other side of the country, for example, great writer, and he's very good at transposing that into a book. He first did a couple of years of a magazine called Whatever Happened To.
Right.
And it was a way to pay tribute to wrestlers who had retired, and he would go and find out about their career and the high spots and some of these stories that you were just telling about being lost, Ray. He would try to get those stories on paper before these people passed away. So it's great that we can do it too.
Oh, yeah.
Hey everybody, Gene Jackson here, inviting you to check out the Retro Wrestling Review, where each week I'm joined by some great co-hosts who help me review classic episodes of USWA Championship Wrestling, and right now we are doing week-by-week reviews of 1993. But we don't just do reviews, sometimes we get a chance to interview some of the people who were there and lived it, plus do watch-alongs. It's a lot of fun, so check out new episodes that drop every Wednesday at WrestleCopia.com. And to find links to everything associated to the podcast, you can go to USWApodcast.com.
Hey guys, Ray Russell here, curator of the WrestleCopia Podcast Network, inviting you guys to listen to many of the programs here as part of the WrestleCopia brand, including, but not limited to, the Wrestling Memory Grenade, currently covering the 1988 and the WWF project. You can also listen to the Regional Wrestling Podcast, where we talk the territories, whether it's Jamie Ward with Georgia 81, Roman Gomez with the UWF in 1986, or Gene Jackson covering Memphis in 85. 3 projects going on right now over there at Regional Wrestling. You can also listen to the Wrestling Stoop with the legend himself, Bob Roop. Bob goes back in time each and every week, covering not just his career, but countless stories and interactions with hundreds of wrestling names spanning his 2 decades in the business. But that's not all. You can also check out the Puro Wrestling Academy with the professor of Puro Resu, Mr. Dan Ginnity. Dan and I go back in time and cover the history of Japanese professional wrestling in the English language. And you can listen to all of those shows and more, all part of the WrestleCopia Podcast Network, located over at WrestleCopia.com. That's WrestleCopia.com, and anywhere your podcast streaming needs are met, from Apple to Spotify, Pocket Cast, and beyond. And while you're at it, why not subscribe to our social media guys for all the latest goings on here at the WrestleCopia Podcast Network. Plus, I'm constantly adding old school video clips and pictures from throughout wrestling history. You can follow us over on X, formerly Twitter, at Wrestling Grenade. That's at RASSLIN Grenade. Also, follow and like me, Facebook.com/Wrestling Grenade. And why not subscribe to YouTube.com/Wrestling Grenade. And of course, now would be a fantastic time to become a WrestleCopia patron. I'm talking about that $5 all-access tier over at patreon.com/WrestleCopia. That address again, patreon.com/WrestleCopia, where you get so many gifts for just $5, including all of my insanely detailed show notes for every episode of The Grenade Show, Regional Wrestling, and the Monday Warfare podcast. You'll also get early access to a lot of the podcasts here on the WrestleCopia brand, where you can listen days and sometimes as much as a week earlier than the rest of the listeners. We also offer remastered versions of the earliest episodes of The Grenade Show covering the 1989 NWA project. Includes enhanced sound quality, plus new content and conversation never heard before. But that's still not all, guys. You also get at least a dozen digital downloads for your viewing and reading pleasure each and every month, plus random bonus video drops, and of course, the Patreon exclusive Watch Along series covering many past WWF and WCW events. And if that's not all, videocasts, also now a part of Patreon. And for those who like all of their podcasts in one nice, neat little pile, the WrestleCopia Patreon also offers a Patreon exclusive Spotify account. You can actually go over to your Spotify with your WrestleCopia Patreon credentials. Instead of listening or downloading directly from Patreon, you can go over to Spotify, listen to all the latest shows, including all of the early releases. And you get all of that and so much more for just $5. No subscription, cancel anytime. Give it a try for a month, guys. I think you'll like the content that I offer, and every penny of it goes right back here into paying the bills. So if you're looking to support that next up-and-coming podcast brand, please consider making it WrestleCopia. Help me pay some of the bills to keep the WrestleCopia Podcast Network and all of the great shows here up and running for the months and the years to come.
For the first giveaway is guys would put the blade in their trunk. The guys, when I broke in, a lot of the boys had the blade in their tights. So when they were going to get ready to use it, all of a sudden they went in their tights. Well, if you're just out in, when they reached in their tights, usually they were alone. There wasn't anything happening to them, and it's very noticeable because
Sure.
when a guy reaches for like brass knucks, they reach in their tights. So the fans are trained. Anytime a guy reaches in his tights, he's going to get something. So when he comes out with an empty hand, they're still curious, and all of a sudden he reaches up to his forehead, and he's making motions, and all of a sudden he gets up and he's bleeding. Then he lifts his tights, and he puts his hand back in his tights, and he gets rid of it in his tights. Well, I looked at that, I said, my God, he's talking about, why don't you just carry a big sign? Hey, I'm getting juiced here. So early on, I decided the way to do it was to wear wristbands, like the tennis players or any athlete's wristbands. You don't want the sweat running down into your hands. Those terry cloth wristbands. I had gone to, I think, red, white, and blue by that time, but even I hadn't. I started wearing the wristband, and what I did was I put the blade under the wristband. That way, all I had to do to get it was to have a guy hit me in the gut, and I could grab my gut with both hands and have my right hand reaching under the wristband on my left hand, and there's the blade right there. Pull it out, have the guy whip me into the corner turnbuckle and hit me with a punch coming out. And, I got punched in the face. I'd reach up to my face. I would be turned around facing back the way I came as I got whipped in that turnbuckle. And I just made I'm on one pass. I was never down. And I got the juice in like a second. All with motions that were rational, like you hit in the gut,
fairly natural.
Go there.
Right.
Yeah, every natural move, because I didn't want to expose my own back.
Well, you hear tell of people hiding the blade pretty much everywhere, from their fingers, their fingertips with the tape to, guys like Tully Blanchard used to keep it in their mouth, which for the life of me, right. I don't know why on earth anybody would think to do that. Put a razor blade in your mouth and hold it there for the duration of the match.
Oh, I know. Me either. The mouth, I tried once. I just stuck it in there, even putting it up against my gum. Said, oh, hell no. You swallow this thing, you might cut your own throat going down.
Yeah.
And then it's going to have to come out the other end too.
Oh my God.
Who knows what it might do to your insides? So yeah. Swallowing a razor blade's not really a good idea.
No.
So I don't care if it. Yeah, but even on the finger, a lot of times after they got juice, there was blood on their finger, and especially if they used white tape. I always use flesh-colored tape, Band-Aids. The flesh-colored Band-Aid. That way, even if I had it on the finger, which I didn't. But another thing was that now smart guys like Ronnie Garvin, Ronnie went every night with tape on his finger, every match. So if he came out and he had a blade under one, you couldn't tell because it wasn't different.
Right.
But if you're a fan of somebody, like say he's your hero, it comes out and there's something different about him. A lot of times you're going to notice it.
Yeah. Right.
Well, he's got a tape on his finger. Did he hurt his finger or what? So you might be watching for it. So to me, it was mortifying. It was going to be just absolute embarrassing to the nth degree to be, if you think about it, take away an audience and take away an opponent, do a video edit where a pro wrestler just does all the moves that he does, but have just the guy doing the move, have just one of them in there, and usually the heel.
Right.
And the stuff you do is just absolutely ridiculous. I mean, think about it. You're taking these weird bumps and, and pratfalls and pie in the face type stuff. Now with the action going and having told a story and builds up a story about the reason these things are happening, then that makes them logical. But without it, oh my God, without people being able to suspend their disbelief, you come across you talk about a clown.
Yeah.
You come across like a fool. And also, it insults people. You expect us to believe this crap?
Well, that's true, too. Yeah.
Yeah. So, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying wrestling's not crap. People understand. And McMahon did it with this is sports entertainment. Mm-hmm. He brought it out as sports entertainment. If you think about it that way, it's a reality play and it's sports entertainment. And obviously, if it was real, nobody ever said boxing is sports entertainment because supposedly the matches are real.
For the most part, right?
Well, I traveled with Jimmy Young, I think was his name, was a heavyweight. He came up and worked as a referee for us, I think, when, I don't know if I was booking or for some reason I carried him to 2 or 3 shows. And he talked to me about the business, about pro boxing, some of that the winner of any match doesn't have to know that the match is just a loser.
Right. If it's rigged. I get you. Yeah.
Yeah. So
all you got to do is tell the loser. Take the dive.
Yep. So.
Well, yeah. I was going to talk about Mike on this episode, but we went there. We discussed Eddie at length, very deep into his life, all the way to his demise. So I don't want to do this all over again on the same episode because Mike Graham's life also ends in tragedy. And in between, Mike Graham's son's life also ends in tragedy. So just not a lot of great stuff to get into discussing that all on one show. So we're going to save Mike for the next episode, I think. And maybe we'll just go into just a few random names from here. Just throw a few names out here and see if you remember working these guys or anything you might remember about them.
Okay. Apologies to any fans out there if what we were talking about was too morbid. But you know what, Ray? I trust you to edit me during mid episode if you think things are getting what you're going to tell me, right?
Yeah, it's history. It's life. It happened and it's out there already. It's not like you're telling anything that hasn't already been exposed for decades now. Eddie's passing and everything that really led into it. So
I don't want to do a program with you that has negative connotations that would turn off your viewers, because you had a lot of people that are listening to this were probably listening, or people who were coming to WrestleCopia before the Stoop ever started. I don't want to turn anybody off.
I don't think that's going to be a concern. It's the wrestling business. These things happen, sadly.
Well,
let's see. Let's see what else we got. Well, this guy passed away at a young age, so I feel bad, awkward mentioning him, but it's for a very different reason. Right before you beat Bill Watts for the Florida title, you have a few matches with the another Olympian, Chris Taylor. These are billed as Olympian matches, obviously, to see maybe who the better Olympian was. You and Big Chris Taylor. Now, I think we mentioned him on an episode many moons ago, but I just wanted to, since we're passing his name here and you're actually stepping in the ring with him at this point, do you have any memories of getting in there with that big dude or anything about him at all?
Oh, yeah. I met him before he actually had really done anything. He just, a guy named Dean Rockwell, the same guy that had that AAU tournament I was telling about, the one that he was the MC who asked Eddie Graham to stand up and take a bow. He had introduced me to Chris at one of the tournaments before Chris ever went to school or went to college. He was a high school wrestler, I guess. And here's this guy, 450, 60 pounds, big, tall guy. Chris was a wonderful guy. He was a sweetheart, good man. But he was, he had some agomally or something. He was a little weird looking.
Yeah.
His features were pronounced and obviously that size. But he was a guy who got a great heart. And when he wrestled in college, he won 3 national championships. And just being big, isn't enough because there's other big guys. But he was very talented too. Well, let's put it this way: he made the Olympic team in 1972. Yep.
I'm sure you got to see him there.
Yeah. I went to work out with him.
Very cool. Getting him ready.
Well, I'd been the Greco-Roman wrestler in '68. I was a pro by '72, but because I didn't get to see anything in the '68 Olympics, the wrestling in the '68 Olympics was late in the Olympics. It was the last week of the Olympics. I never got to see anything in the Olympics '68 because we were training all the time.
Right.
So I wanted to go in '72. I wanted to watch at least the wrestling, and if I could get to see track or swimming, that'd be good too. But so yeah, that's why I was over there. And somebody had told me that Chris didn't really have anybody back in the United States. He had people to work out with, but over there, the only guy he had to work out with was the 220 pounder on the team. So I was I was weighing about 270. I figured I could at least go up there and push around with him a little bit. But one of the things, I don't know if I shared this before or not, but Dan Gable was in that Olympics, and Dan wrestled freestyle. And he was, 148, somewhere in there, that weight class. And he wrestled 6 or 7 matches. 3 of the matches had wrestlers who had either been world champions or had placed in the top 3 in the world. And he never had a point scored against him, not 1 point. One of the greatest wrestling displays ever. That's why the name of the museum that all my stuff in Waterloo is a Dan Gable Museum.
Right.
But when the reason I'm talking about Gable is when I went to work out with Chris, one of my teammates was on the Greco-Roman team. And I was talking to him, and I looked over, and who did I see working out? I'd seen him the night before on the reviewing stand getting his gold medal, and his eyebrow got busted open in his last match, so he's got his eyebrow taped. Dan Gable's over there working out.
Oh wow!
You talk about dedication, or
no kidding,
kind of phobia or something. But you don't get to be that good without putting in the work. So he was certainly do it.
Sure.
And a funny story. I asked my teammate. My teammate was from high school, from college. It was a guy named Buck Dietrich. He was from California, and when he came to Illinois, he considered us all hicks and rednecks and country folk and all that. He was like a beach bum, and so he was always lording it over everybody socially. Well, when I talked to him in Munich all those years later, like 5 years later, I asked him about, for some reason, it just struck me. I said, hey, by the way, have you worked out with Gable? I could hear he's over working out with the Greco-Roman guys. And my teammate looked down at the ground, and I knew he wasn't going to lie to me. I knew he had. I said, well, how'd it go? He said, I said, well, you're not going to tell me you couldn't beat the guy. He said, well, yeah, I could, but I said I couldn't pin him. And he said, he just keeps going, man. He said, after about 30 minutes, I blew up. He turned me over and pinned me. And he was 220, and Gable was 140. Wow. So, yeah, I laughed. But, yeah, that's the kind of style and class and ability that Gable had, all that work. Now, Chris Taylor, did you ever see the picture of him being suplexed?
Yeah.
It was one of the most famous pictures in the wrestling pictures ever taken during my generation, anyway. A guy that size being thrown, actual thrown, and you really can't tell it unless you know wrestling what's happening. But now transposed to Chris being in pro wrestling, he was together. In fact, one time when he was together in Tampa, so I was in a room with Chris and Andre and Eddie and myself, and you talk about being in fast company. Two of the biggest guys the two biggest guys in the business. And Chris and I worked in Tampa and in some other place too. I tried to give him the shoulder breaker, but I couldn't get him up. I couldn't get him on my shoulder. His midsection was too big. He wasn't real sloppy. He was pretty solid, even though he had a lot of extra weight. It was not your hanging, swinging type blubber. It was more solid. But I couldn't get all that mass up past my arm, up on my shoulder. So I ended up kind of halfway slamming him. Did something, jumped up and dropped the knee on him or something off the turnbuckle. But he was a good guy. Died way too young. Him and Andre both.
Yeah, and they both, had their health issues, obviously, and I think it was like cardiovascular situation or something with Taylor. But he had to retire early. He was a Vern guy, I think. He worked up there in Minnesota some, but he's down here working with Bob Roop in 1975, Florida. It's an unfortunate story because, again, I think he was like 6'5", 6'6", like 400 pounds. Yeah. He was a very big dude. You talk about that suplex, that picture, the world's most famous suplex throw in wrestling. Yes. Anyway, yeah. Absolutely. I think it was Dietrich that threw him, the German guy.
Wilfried Dietrich from Germany.
Yeah.
Yeah, Dietrich was no slouch. He took, in the 60 Olympics, he took gold and won. He took gold and silver in freestyle and Greco-Roman. I'm not sure which one was which. So, he was one of the top heavyweights in the world. He actually had set up Chris for that suplex. Back then there were 2 rounds. At the end of the first round, and there's a minute in between. At least you get a minute rest period to wipe off and wipe the sweat off you and take a little break. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the first period, Dietrich had lured Chris into doing that, going underneath his arms so where he could reach over, but he did it while he was near the edge of the ring, the edge of the mat, or being off the mat. And he actually tried to suplex, and he let go of it when he saw I think he saw it was going to work. Because in order to do it, he had to be able to get his arms around Chris.
Right.
That's what it was. He threw him from a bear hug. That's right. Chris was the one that went over the top. Yeah, he did. He tried that right before. He had to see if he could get his arms around him, and he just barely could. He just had his fingers. His fingers were locked. So as soon as the second period started, because Chris is relatively dry. He's not sweating. Where you're going to slip. You have a chance to slip
right.
You hold the slip. So, as soon as he set him up again out in the middle of the ring, as soon as Chris was going to overhook the arm and do his own throw. But he went first. Dietrich went first, and I was sitting about 25 feet away in the American section. And when he did the hold, I jumped up in the air. I don't even know how I went from sitting to standing, but all of a sudden I'm about 8 feet in the air, my head anyway. And oh my God! Because all the American fans looked at me like, "You butthead! What are you?" I looked at him like, "Yeah, I've never seen a move like that in my life.
Right?
Nobody's going to ever say anything like that." My God! Yeah, I'm sorry that Chris was the one getting beat, but oh my God, what a move! How can you not accomplish something that's just unbelievably athletic?
Right.
So. Yeah, but Chris was a good guy. Nice. He was a sweetheart, real sweet guy. Imagine somebody like that, and Andre, being nasty. Just being thugs.
Yeah.
Yeah. We were, they might not have made in the business. When you're that big, you're also quite a target for somebody with a little 22 pistol.
Well,
so,
if you're not going to cooperate, you won't be making money very long anyway. So
that's true.
Yeah.
That's true.
Well, let's talk. We mentioned these guys too at the end of last episode, and I didn't know if you'd have any memories of them, and I don't know what you really truly remember or not. But I wanted to bring them up because, like I said, you talked about the guys from the North would love to stop through in Florida on a vacation, or whether it's one show or maybe they're there for a month or whatever while talent's moving in and out of the territory. I'm sure they'll go back to New York before too long. But I'm referring to, there's a tag team here at this time that you work off and on early on in 75. A couple of Italian boys, Dominic Denucci and Tony Parisi, come down to Florida. And that was such an odd fit for me to see them down here, but here they are. Do you remember anything about either one of those guys?
Yeah, I do. And I remember Dominic being a pretty likable guy. Parisi was aloof. When he talked to me, just the bare minimum of things needed to be said. And I don't know why I didn't. I try to be collegial, I try to be appropriate. I don't force myself on people, but yeah, and they were a decent team. Again, I don't remember the matches. I don't remember what we did in the matches. So it had to be okay. I don't know. They might feel different, but I think that they were guys down there for winter break too. They weren't there that long, were they?
Without going back, I'm not sure. I think they were there at least a month, though.
Okay. No, I don't remember. I never had a beer with them, or I never saw them like after at the club or on the road, or in fact, I don't remember them. I don't remember watching their matches either. When they were out there with somebody else. Right.
It's just something different. Definitely different talent coming through with a different style, that New York style, I'm sure. Well, Parisi, he added a little bit, but Denucci, I got to know Denucci a little bit. I won't say that we were, close or anything, but him being in the Pittsburgh area, he would come over to Ohio indie shows and whatnot in the 80s and 90s, even in the 2000s. And so even if he wasn't booked, even if he wasn't there to wave and smile at the fans, even if he was just sitting backstage, he would ride sometimes just to have something to do. He would roll in with some of the boys, and he was always such a nice guy. He passed away a few years ago now, but I think he was about 90 years old when he passed, though. So he lived a life. Yeah.
I think he trained Mick Foley, didn't he?
He did train Mick Foley and a couple of other guys.
Nick writes up. That's where I remember. Nick wrote about him in his book, one of his books, and he put him over. He gave him kudos. He gave him credit. He said he was good.
I always get a laugh out of a segment they did with Denucci. By the time Foley won the world title in the WWE, they do this segment where, he's back training with Denucci or whatever for some kind of match coming up. And Denucci's, they actually put him on TV, Dominic. And he's like, "Oh, Mick, you got there. You're going to win the title tonight." But the problem was Mick was already champion. So Foley had to ad-lib, "Dominic, I'm already champion." So I just thought that was funny. But yeah, I got to love Dominic. Yeah. Good stuff.
Well,
we're live, pal.
Hey, he's a pro wrestler. What do you expect? Yeah, well, that's nice. Nick had nice things to say about. Mick had nice things to say about him too. So.
Yeah, I don't know that you could say a whole lot negative. Dominic just seemed like an easygoing guy. Of course, I knew him in his later years. Yeah, he stuck around the Northeast for a very long period of his career. So
you had that Italian component in New York,
absolutely.
Boston and all the cities they worked up there on the East Coast. Most of the big cities had an Italian area in town where a lot of the Italian folks lived in one area. I know they did in New York because when they were first coming to the country during the early part of the 20th century, between 1920 and 1960, so many people came over that they didn't go west. They just kind of settled around the East Coast, started trying to make a living. It was the same thing in Australia with Mario Milano and Spiros Arion.
Right.
So yeah, it's nice. It's good for those guys. It'd be great to be able to stay in one area for 20 years. You're going to be home a lot more than somebody who who's got a. I moved 5 or 6 times. Well, once I got married, I had to move my family too.
Yeah.
And make a mistake of buying a house, and that totally, what a horrible mistake that is.
Yeah,
because you're going to eventually have to leave it.
Crazy life, man.
Oh man, well, it was interesting. Interesting enough that here we are talking about it.
Absolutely,
so, yeah. No regret at all.
You talk about interesting. Here's an interesting name that pops back up after a few years. You haven't seen him too much since your we'll call it the tour of Iraq. Adnan Al-Kaissie. The Sheik, the future General Adnan during the Gulf War, managing Sergeant Slaughter, Vince McMahon exploiting the war there in New York, many moons after this. But here in 1975, Adnan pops up in Florida, the territory you're working in. And I don't know if you've seen him at this point since Iraq, but it's not been too many times since then. And now you're working him. It looks like more often than not in Fort Lauderdale. So maybe you guys had a little thing going specifically in that city, but it's just interesting to see you cross paths with this guy again. Do you remember having any hostility towards him? Was there ever a crossword with him? Anything, or was it just, it wasn't even mentioned? Iraq never happened?
Or the latter, more than it never happened.
Okay.
I didn't like him. I didn't hate him, but in Iraq, he acted so superior, and he was. I mean, he was like I said, he was bigger than Dusty Rhodes and Junkyard Dog put together in Iraq. He was under a lot of pressure there too, and he was never friendly to me, not one time. He was always kind of curt, spoke as little as possible, wasn't very friendly. He certainly wasn't very appreciative, and he didn't care about my health. He didn't make sure I was out of that arena, that second match, that I was safe. But I had forgiven him. The problem was I was running Fort Lauderdale. I was working in the office, and I booked him against myself. We didn't draw, and I don't want to blame him, but he probably should have been a heel. He came as a babyface. It just, I wish to say it was got to be my fault too. But we just couldn't make people mad enough at me with him. We tried it in West Palm Beach too. It just didn't work. So, but he and I never have spent 1 second out of the arena. In fact, I don't recall being in a dressing room with him. Let's see, Fort Lauderdale had different dressing rooms, and West Palm Beach had different dressing rooms. So I wasn't in a dressing room with him there. Now I would have seen him at TV, because when we did TV and did interviews, if he was, let me think, would he have been doing? Yeah, he would have been doing interviews for Fort Lauderdale, or at least for West Palm Beach. But no, being I was a heel, he was a babyface. He had all the reasons in the world, not to hobnob with me anywhere. He didn't have to come cozy up to me at the interviews either. Although the rest of the boys did. The guys you were working with that you liked, and you were busting your butt, and you guys were drawing money together. You saw them at TV, and while you're waiting to interview, if you got free time, you can talk to each other. Guys cut up and show their affection for one another, the regard or respect or whatever, by ribbing and joking and, chit chat. Just kind of the way to do it, or a chance to do it. But I don't ever remember doing that with him. But, another factor was I didn't know he hadn't written his book yet. And I didn't know about Saddam Hussein yet. If I'd known about Saddam Hussein, I might have tried to stop him from coming there, because I wouldn't have wanted to work with him. Well, the guy, Hannibal Lecter's the promoter, and you don't tell the guy you're bringing, into Russell.
Right.
And Hannibal's the promoter, and he wants you over to his house for dinner right after the match. The dinner's going to be your liver. I didn't feel, once I found out about Saddam, I still might have not said anything or written a book about it, except that he treated Andre and George Gordenko like trash by saying they were crybabies and leaning on his strong shoulders to get through the match. When I was there, Casey was the one that was falling apart. So anyway, though our matches were okay, good enough worker. He wasn't a national champion, but he placed in the top 4. He was an All-American at Oklahoma State as an amateur wrestler, I think at 191. Then he became Billy White Wolf. A few years. White Wolf, yeah. And married an American woman. He had a new career with the Iraqi war. Gave him a new lease on life. Yeah, my buddy Cosgrove got hooked up with him on that one.
Yeah, they brought. Well, Sheiky got lucky there because his knees were gone, his body was gone, and Vince Jr., if you will, Vincent Kennedy McMahon, he had some kind of love for the Iron Sheik because he gave that guy so many opportunities when, he failed so many drug tests in the late 80s, and he kept getting another shot. The funny story with the Sheik, I don't know if you've ever heard this one, Bob, because this was in your time. You were there during this period. George Scott, this is prior to you coming. George Scott was Booker briefly before he got himself fired there in the NWA after Ted Turner had purchased the company. And one of the things he did was go back and rehire a bunch of guys that were top-level athletes when he was booking years prior. And so he goes and he signs the Iron Sheik to a 1-year contract. Problem is, Sheik's so bad in the ring by 89, he works a few matches and they send him home. But they forget that he's under contract in 1990, and his contract rolls over an entire another year. So Sheik gets paid for 2 years of doing almost absolutely nothing.
Well, I'm happy for him.
And that shows you who was running the finances in the office of Turnerland there during that period. I hope that wasn't you, Bob. maybe you had your hand in that, knowing how close you were with Khosrow. Maybe that had something to do with you. I don't know.
Well, when Khosrow, we talked about him when we were talking about Ole. He was great in the dressing room. He was a guy that
I can only imagine
raised everybody's morale because he was funny. He was a crap disturber, but he was a showman.
Yeah.
He had that. He would turn on his accent, and he was a hoot. And I'm sure that if he put Vince Jr. over, and he ribbed him and made him feel, that might be. You know what? That might have been. I just came to me. I told you about how he used to rib Ole. He'd in front of all the boys. He'd say, Ole Anderson, you act like big tough guy. You're Sheik, Iron Sheik, third in the world, Greco-Roman. You think Iron Sheik's a tough guy? You're a nobody. And then of course, they'd have a match or whatever. And you'd pinch him or gig him or kick him or something. But it was fun, the boys would be laughing.
Right.
Well, I'm just extrapolating that performance to Khosrow doing the same thing to Vince Jr. You're kind of making him feel like one of the boys.
Yeah.
When you do that, and he would love that. Sheik would almost be like now some boys might say stooge. I don't look at it that way. If you have the ability to ingratiate yourself to get a chance to do it, it's not like the guy's giving you a payoff for not doing anything. You still got to go out there and work. But if you go out and do the same match, instead of getting paid $100 for doing it in the first match, you get paid $1,000 for doing it in the last match. Well, if you can figure your way to get in the last match, if that includes creating a connection to the boss that has been wanting to promote you, go for it. I don't have any problem with him doing that. I don't consider that being a stooge. I consider that being a smart businessman. I wish I'd have had that ability to be, to cut up like that. But, Khosrow he was an interesting character, but you know what he also was? Just like Chris Colt, he was fun.
Right.
He was fun to be around.
Sounds that way, yeah.
Oh, man, he was fun to be around. Why do you think Dugan was hanging around with him?
They were feuding, right?
Yeah. But he wasn't some dull, get in the car, drink 6 beers, not say a word, or the old timers like Orton Sr. and a bunch of guys he rode with. These guys are all talking conspiracy theories.
Right.
We're talking back in the early 70s. They're talking conspiracy theories about the blacks are going to do this and the Jews are going to do that, and all this racist crap. And I rode with them one time. I got stuck with them. I rode that. I refused to get in the car with any of them after that.
Yeah.
If that's what you guys want to talk about, maybe they were doing it as a rib. I don't know, but I sure didn't enjoy it. Well, yeah, you have somebody like Khosrow who's just keeps everybody in a good mood. And,
sure.
That would be another factor to have him. The dressing rooms and the boys, instead of being in there all sullen and quiet, bitching about their payoffs, Khosrow's got them laughing at something. Yeah, I can see why. Think about it. I can see why someone like Vince Jr. would want to have him around.
Yeah.
Vince Jr. hadn't made it yet. It wasn't until they had some really success. When he was fighting against Georgia, he almost went out of business a couple of times, right?
I mean, I don't know all the specifics. I know, they were still trying to go national at that point. They hadn't done WrestleMania yet. In fact, they used that Georgia TV to help promote WrestleMania up until the weekend of that first WrestleMania. That was the last episode of Vince's version of the Georgia show, and then he sold it to Crockett. So he used it for what he wanted it for, really. It was to get that national exposure for WrestleMania, to draw all the people out to those closed circuit locations. So that was a wise business move at the end of the day for Vince. And of course, he sells it off to Crockett, and Crockett has a successful run there for a few years anyway. And of course, wrestling will stay on TBS through 2000 or so at that point, with Turner taking over eventually. But what a interesting history is wrestling, and all the guys that transition from one territory to another, one promotion to another, and the stories that you're able to share. Think about the Iron Sheik from the 70s to the Iron Sheik in the 80s, even getting to work, like you said, during that Gulf War era, doing the storyline with Sergeant Slaughter and whatnot there in the WWF in the early 90s. And even beyond, Vince would continue to bring him back, have him manage guys and things. And it wasn't because Sheiky could cut a good promo, because we know that's not true. He might have been entertaining, but he wasn't going to be the greatest, manager mouthpiece in the history of wrestling. But
yeah, I don't know. Well, if he was doing the nationalist thing about Iraq, or in his case it'd be Iran, because he was from Iran. When he did his Iraq things with the flag, he would be waving the Iraqi flag,
right,
or the Iranian flag. I'm sorry, he was from Iran. Ironically, he had disrespect for Iraq, but
right.
he did the thing with Adnan
and Slaughter,
General Adnan, just because it was
employment.
Money.
It was a job. Yeah, absolutely.
When he was doing the nationalist thing, especially when we were having any kind of wars or whatever, and he was waving that Iranian flag and talking about was down with USA. Hey, he got some serious heat with that. He had to watch his back. He'd be waving that flag, and I mean, there were people when he was out there. I got a lot of chance to watch because he'd get some serious heat.
Yeah, I can imagine. But it's kind of ironic. For several years there, Iron Sheik was tag team partners with Nikolai Volkov in the WWF, and the only thing you ever hear is, well, we just talked a little bit about how the Iron Sheik wasn't necessarily his character. He didn't necessarily support all of the terrible things happening over there in the Middle East. But at the same time, you always hear the stories of Nikolai Volkov absolutely hated communism. He hated that part of Russia. He's, Lithuania when he's living here in the United States, but he played that character almost his entire career up until near the end. They had him transform into a U.S. citizen, an American, and kind of pay it off, I guess. But Nikolai, he was another guy that, that's how you made your money. You played the character, but kind of interesting. I did want to touch on what we're going to discuss next episode, because there's some videos out there I want some people to go check out. Maybe you can refresh yourself, Bob, too, out there on YouTube.
I will.
We're going to talk about Mike Graham. I want to get that in. But also, you have a feud upcoming for the summer of 75 against Rocky Johnson. And to my surprise, just a quick Google search, several of your matches with Rocky are on YouTube. Now, they are condensed into 5-minute videos, with Gordon Soley doing the commentary, what they would show on TV of the match is basically what's out there. But lumberjack match, one-on-one, Bob Roop versus Rocky Johnson. Great tag match. Bob Roop teaming with Harley Race against Cyclo Negro and Rocky Johnson. There's a couple more out there. So look them up. They're fun. And I got to say, you look in tremendous shape back in 75, and you're bumping. I'm not going to call it Kurt Hennig-esque, because that's over the top. If anybody ever saw Mr. Perfect Kurt Hennig bump, it wasn't to that level, Bob. I can't give you that much credit, but it was amazing watching you bump, and some of the things you were doing, how fast in motion you were, because it wasn't like, going out there and working a squash where you're just picking apart a job guy. This was really good stuff. This was top level stuff from both sides, and just really fun stuff to watch. So I encourage you guys, before we talk about some of this stuff, Bob, you too, go out and check these matches out. Refresh your memory. I'm sure it'll bring back some fun times for you.
Oh, well, thank you, Ray. It will. Yeah, I enjoy looking back at that, because I've been removed from that kind of condition for so long. It's nice to think, I kind of vaguely remember one time being in shape and being able to do stuff and not having knees hurt after riding in the car for a half hour. But, yeah, that'll be good. I'll do that. I'll refresh, and thank you for today, my friend. As usual, your leadership of the way you set up the show and the way you lead me and get me on the right path is always very, very. I'm very grateful for it. I might bring a lot of the content to the show, but you organize that content, and I have to say you're the one that's responsible for the overall quality of it, and I appreciate that, and I hope our listeners do too.
All right, guys, that's going to wrap it up for this week. Like I said, next week we return. It's Mike Graham. It's Rocky Johnson. We'll even talk about you teaming with Abdullah the Butcher, and maybe we'll get some thoughts on you just in regards to Abby and whatnot, and so many more names to travel through here in 75 and beyond. Of course, you're going to be here for all of this year and next year, 1976. So lots to come here in the Sunshine State of Florida. Until next time, this is not Gordon Soley saying so long. Thank you again, Bob.
You're Ray. Stay well, my friend. And I'm sorry, Ray.
Yeah.
I thank who we should really be thanking.
Uh-huh.
Thank all out there who are listening to this.
Absolutely.
Without you, don't need to be here, and we like being here. So thank you very, very much.
All right, guys, that's going to wrap things up here this week. But in the meantime and in between time, I encourage everybody to go out there and follow friend Mr. Bob Roop over at facebook.com/poorBobRoop. And you can find me, Ray Russell. Follow me on X, formerly Twitter, at Wrestling Grenade. That's at RASSLIN Grenade. Also, follow and like me, facebook.com/Wrestling Grenade. But most of all, I encourage everybody to go over to patreon.com/WrestleCopia. That address again, patreon.com/WrestleCopia. So many great gifts there, including early show releases, digital downloads, video casts now available, and so much more. Check it out over at Patreon. Help support the brand. And until next time, on behalf of Bob, we ask you guys to hold tight and see where we head next time. Right here on the Wrestling Stoop with the legend himself, Bob Roop.